I'm going to tell you a story of something that happened to me in third grade. We moved into a new development in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey. It was called Oak Park because oaks are what the bulldozers had knocked down in order to build the development. And our house was the first house to be built in a circle. Then they built them from right to left, so the lot to the left of us was undeveloped for a full year after we moved in. And there was a little pond on that lot, and I used to go over there every day after school to see what was happening. In the spring, this is what was happening. Toads came and sang, and the singers invited bigger toads and gave them a hug, and I thought that was nice. They kept hugging them until eggs came. Then, of course, the eggs hatched into pollywogs, and that's what I wanted to watch. I wanted to watch metamorphosis. I wanted to watch these little guys turn into even littler guys. The tail would shrink, and the hind legs would pop out, and the front legs would pop out, until finally you had a little terrestrial toad. And they really are little when they come out. I made it a goal to be at that pond when those little guys first jumped out onto the land. And I was lucky. It must have been a Saturday or something, because I was there. And out they came by the 10s and the 20s and the 30s. And it was really an exciting time for a little third grader. Except that very afternoon, the bulldozer came and buried the whole pond. So that was the end of the little toads. It was not the end of the big toads, because they're not at the pond at that time. But in essence, it was the end of the big toads, because they had lost their breeding site. I lived there another 17 years, and I can tell you that was local extinction for that population of toads in that corner of Berkeley Heights, New Jersey. It was local extinction for the garter snakes that ate the toads. It was local extinction for everything associated with the food web that was attached to that little pond. And the problem, of course, is that that has happened so many places since then, in so many times since then, in so many places since then, that we literally are losing the plants and animals we share the planet with. I wish we shared the planet as well as these two birds are sharing a sycamore in my backyard, but we haven't for two reasons. The first reason is that we haven't thought we needed to. We thought we could develop spaces almost any place, and there would always be a lot of nature left someplace else. And of course, the reason we've thought that is that that has been our history. Through most of our history, there weren't all that many humans, and there was a lot of nature out there, and we could develop indiscriminately without worrying about it. That, by the way, is a caterpillar that's covered its back with liatris petals. It's called the camouflage looper, very common. The second reason that we haven't shared the planet very well is that we truly do not believe that we need other species for our own well-being. You know, we hear it, sometimes we talk about it, but we couldn't possibly believe it the way we're treating other species. They always get second shift. When you think about it, though, when we develop living spaces for ourselves that don't support life, that could be a clear signal that our life support systems, the ones that keep us going, are in jeopardy or will be shortly. And that, of course, is something that we cannot afford to let happen. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about why we need nature. I'm going to use the term nature and biodiversity interchangeably, because they are. So why do we need biodiversity? Why do we need to change the way we landscape in order to save biodiversity? Why does animal diversity depend on native plants? Not plants that evolved in China or Europe, but plants that evolved right here. And finally, we'll talk about how to make our landscapes sustainable. Now, I used to have the word more in there, make them more sustainable, until I thought about what the word sustainable means. Being sustainable is like being pregnant. You either are or you aren't. And right now, most of our landscapes are not sustainable. So what can we do to make them that way? Let's start with a definition. What is biodiversity? There are actually a lot of definitions of biodiversity, and there's lots of types of it. You can have genetic diversity, you can have population diversity, ecosystem diversity, but most people think of biodiversity in terms of species diversity. And we still have a lot of species out there. We've got over 420,000 species of plants. Latest figure on the count of insects was 3.7 million. The reason it's an estimate is because we've only identified about 1 million of them. There are far fewer species of vertebrates, but still a lot of them. About 31,000 species of fish, about 15,000 species of reptiles and amphibians. Only 5,400 species of mammals, a third of which are already endangered, like these little white tent bats from Central America. And then about 9,700 species of birds. Now, each one of these species has a particular role in its ecosystem. And if you have a healthy ecosystem, you have what we call redundancy, where you have several species doing the same job. The good thing about redundancy is that it's a backup system. It's like a backup quarterback. If one of those species were to disappear, the other species doing that ecosystem service would be there to fill in the gap, and the service would be performed, and all would be well. The problem comes, though, when we simplify ecosystems to the point where there's only one or maybe two species doing a particular job. Then if they disappear, the job is not done, and you start to get ecosystem failure. So why do we need biodiversity? That is the main reason. It is biodiversity that runs ecosystems. And we happen to depend on those ecosystems. If you have a diverse ecosystem, it's more stable, it's more productive, meaning it makes more ecosystem services, which we need. It's less susceptible to invasion by alien organisms, something we're encountering more and more these days. So those are all good things. I'm trying to encourage people to think of the plants and animals around them, as the life around them, as the rivets that hold your lives together, that hold your ecosystems together, your environment. It's not the environment, as if it's something separate that you can do without. It's your environment. It's the only one you have. And please don't forget that is what sustains us. So many people, particularly our young people, think it's the mall that sustains them. Maybe the mall does sustain them. But everything that's in the mall comes from a healthy ecosystem. And that's a message we have not been very successful in getting across. Now, back in 1949, Aldo Leopold wrote what is now a very famous book in the world of conservation called Sand County Almanac. And this is the first line in that book. Aldo says, there are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. But I disagree with that. I'm going to argue that there is nobody who can live without wild things, because it is those wild things that run the ecosystems that keeps that person alive. You do not have to like wild things, but you absolutely need them. And that's because of those ecosystem services I'm talking about. What's an ecosystem service? Just think of it as all the things we take for granted every single day, like the production of oxygen. Now, how many people woke up this morning and wondered whether you have enough oxygen this afternoon? I forget to do that too. But let's face it, it is plants that make oxygen, and we're not being very nice to plants. We have already gotten rid of half of the forest that once were on this planet, and we're continuing to chip away at the rest of them. And some of you folks will say, yeah, but it's really the algae in the ocean that makes the oxygen that keeps us going. And you're largely correct there. But look what we're doing to our oceans. So either way, we need plants for oxygen. We need plants to clean our water. As a matter of fact, it's plants that deliver almost all of the ecosystem services that keep us around. Clean water is good. We need plants to build topsoil and to keep it from eroding away. That's a good thing. As a matter of fact, we need plants to prevent flooding. Plants, healthy, large, forested ecosystems moderate weather patterns all over the globe. When you have diverse ecosystems, you do not have weather events that look like this. It's a highly underappreciated ecosystem service delivered by plants. It's biodiversity that recycles our garbage, another ecosystem service. And it's animals that pollinate those plants. I think it's 80% of our plants are pollinated by animals. 20% are pollinated by wind. So we've got to keep the animals around as well. And then carbon sequestration. It's plants that are sequestering carbon. A really important ecosystem service that we're just starting to think about now. This is a ceiba tree in the forests of Costa Rica. It is 600 years old, and it is built out of carbon that is pulled from carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, locked up in its tissues, has already held it there for 600 years. I hear all the time that trees are not a permanent solution to our carbon woes. That's true, but I'll take a 600-year solution any day while we figure out what to do with the rest of it. You can tell that's 18 people right there. That's a large tree. So we ought to be putting trees like this all over the planet as fast as possible. Slow-growing, long-lived trees that are going to grab that carbon and hold it for a long period of time. Instead, we are still deforesting the planet at a rate of 50,000 acres a day. So that's something we're not taking advantage of. You might think it's everybody else who's doing that, because everybody else is doing that, but we're doing that as well. This is the plan for the U.S. in the next 50 years. We are slated to develop another 75 million acres of forest land. Not farmland where the trees are already gone, but forest land. If we do that, that will release 5.4 billion tons of additional carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is the same as putting 100 million new cars on the road. Now, this is the plan, and I contend that we can develop that land without taking most of those trees down, if that becomes our goal. Also increasing evidence, new ecosystem service, that we really need to interact with nature, with biodiversity, other living things, particularly when we're young, for healthy mental development. And this message is coming from Richard Louv, who wrote this book, Last Child in the Woods, where he recognizes something he calls nature deficit disorder. He says our kids are simply not out playing in nature anymore. And at the same time, they're suffering from elevated levels of ADHD and childhood obesity and childhood depression. He said, maybe there's a link between the two. Let's do some research. Okay, that's a great idea. What are our kids doing? Well, whatever it is, it's electronic. So Richard Louv also says our kids are the future stewards of the planet. And we don't have to do any research to know that that is correct. And he says if they don't develop an emotional relationship with the things they're supposed to be stewarding, they're going to be lousy stewards. So Richard says, let's get the kids out of the house, let them run out in the backyard, turn over the rock, and play with the salamander. And I couldn't agree more, except today we have sterilized our neighborhoods to the point where the kids can run out of the house and turn over the rock if there is a rock, and there will be no salamander. We have eliminated nature from the lives of most of our kids on a daily basis. They can still take a field trip and see it someplace, but most kids cannot do this. I can show you this picture because that's my granddaughter. But we can put nature, the reasons our kids have nature deficit disorder is that we have a deficit in nature, and we have a deficit in nature because we landscape like this. We can put nature back into the lives of our kids, back into our own lives if we understand where it comes from and how to manipulate it. So where does animal diversity come from? Well, it comes from plants. And the more plants you have, the more animals you have. It's that simple. And that's because of this relationship. We all learned about it in high school. Call it photosynthesis. If you had to memorize that equation, you realize it's pretty complicated. It's really one of the major miracles of life. Plants allow us to eat sunlight. And if they didn't do that, we would not be here. They do that by capturing the energy from sun, combining it with carbon dioxide from the air, water from the ground, producing the oxygen we all still need. And now the energy from the sun is tied up in the carbon bonds of simple sugars and carbohydrates, which happens to be the basis of all food webs on this planet, with the minor exception of some sulfur-based food webs at the bottom of the ocean. And I don't want to have to depend on them for food. So let's just say plants are making all the food. Plants also have physical structure. So they're making the housing. They're making the shelter for animal life. If you have plants making food and shelter, you can look at the amount of plant life in a given space and estimate what the carrying capacity of that space is. What's carrying capacity? That's just an ecological term that describes the amount of life that can be supported indefinitely, sustainably. That's what sustainably means. In a given spot, without degrading the resource base of that spot. That's why it can go on forever. We can plot carrying capacity. This dotted line here, let's just say that that's the number of plants we have in an area. And I like to think of carrying capacity as if it were the principal in an ecological bank account, ecological savings account. So remember when we used to have savings accounts? They used to generate interest. And we could live off that interest forever as long as we didn't dip into the principal. That's what's happening here. You've got plants making ecological interest in the form of food and shelter, and animal populations can grow and use that food and shelter and cycle forever as long as they don't dip into the plants that are making it, as long as they don't reduce the amount of principal that's generating that ecological interest. If we do reduce the amount of plant life in a given space, there'll be less ecological interest, and any animal population, depending on that, will crash down below the new carrying capacity. That's how carrying capacity works. This is an eastern deciduous forest, very high carrying capacity because it's making so much food and so much shelter compared to a suburban lawn. For obvious reasons. We have taken the plants away from that space. Now it's true, that's a plant and that's a plant. But it's just a tiny fraction of the plant life that used to be in this area, generating just a tiny fraction of the ecological interest that used to support animal life, which means there's just a tiny fraction of the animal life in this space. If this were the only suburban development in the US, we would not have a problem. But it forces us to ask the question, what have we done to the carrying capacity of the US? And I love this picture because it tells us very clearly what we have done. This, of course, is Manhattan Island. That's what it looked like 400 years ago when it sustainably supported a population of 600 humans. Very high carrying capacity because all the plants were there. And this is what it looks like today when essentially all the plants are gone. Now, I know there are plants in Central Park, and there's a tree that grows in Brooklyn. People from Manhattan get upset when I talk about that. But let's face it, the carrying capacity of Manhattan is very close to zero. And yet, there's some 8 million people that live in and around the metropolitan area. How can you have 8 million people living where the carrying capacity is zero? You could do that because resources move around. Ecosystem services move around. So the people of Manhattan get their oxygen from all over the world. They get their food from all over the world. They get their water from the Catskills. They send their garbage to New Jersey. It works for the people of Manhattan and every other city in the world because there are healthy ecosystems someplace else generating the ecosystem services that those people need. If we turn the entire world into Manhattan, it's just not going to work. This is the distribution of virgin forests in the US in 1620 when European settlers first started coming to the east. And that is the distribution of virgin forests in the US in 1920 because we had cut them all down. We cut them down because we were an agrarian society and we needed to remove the forest so we could grow our crops. Fortunately, we did not cut them all down at the same time. We did it moving from east to west. And as we moved from east to west, we had the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of people moved off the farm into cities. And many of those forests grew back. They grew back in the form of secondary forest structure, secondary growth. All of the forests we see around us are secondary growth. Most of us have never seen a primary forest, at least in the east. But these are good places. Many of these trees are over 100 years old. And this now is where the biodiversity in the eastern deciduous biome has got to live. The problem, of course, is that we haven't stopped growing. We're still adding 5,700 people to the US every day. And those people need something to eat and a place to live. So we're out there sprawling. And we have taken that secondary forest structure and we have fragmented it. When I go flying a plane, this is what I see. I see little habitat fragments all over the place. So the question is, are these little habitat fragments, many of which are completely isolated from other fragments, are they big enough to maintain the biodiversity that we need? And I should say sustain. By sustain, I don't mean for 5 years. I mean forever. We need a long-term plan here. We've got about 129 million homes in the US. When you turn the lights on at night, that's what it looks like. Peggy and I come from right there. Well, yeah, where are we? We're up here. It's still pretty bright. But let's face it, Maine looks great compared to where we come from down south of Philadelphia. Connecting all of these bright lights, of course, are roads. We have over 4 million miles of roads in the US. If you calculate the paved surface area of those roadways, it's equal to, 5 times the size of New Jersey? Paved over. If pavement were a functioning ecosystem, that would be okay. But it's not. And then, of course, we've got a love affair with the lawn. Last figure I saw was 45.6 million acres of lawn. We are adding 500 square miles of lawn to the US every year. Can't do that forever before everything is lawn. Again, if that were a functioning ecosystem, maintaining the diversity of life that we need to run our ecosystems, it would be okay. It would look different from what the old ecosystems look like, but it would still function. Problem is, it is not. So we're talking about human-dominated ecosystems from coast to coast. We've got to give up the notion that nature is happy out there somewhere. 41% of the US is in some form of agriculture. It looks like this if you fly over Michigan. It looks like that if you fly over Oregon. It looks like that if you fly over most of the West. You look down there, you see these vast empty spaces. Well, there's a cow on every acre, believe me. 54% is in what I call the suburban-urban matrix. It's this matrix of cities and suburbs and those little habitat fragments that I was talking about. So again, the question is, are those habitat fragments big enough to sustain nature? If you're wondering where that 54% of the suburban matrix is, it's largely in the east there. This is the light pollution map in the US. So that leaves 5% of the US that's still considered pristine, but most of those areas are either too high, like Mount Hood here in Oregon, or too dry to support the biodiversity that we need, which is why we haven't taken them for our own use. We have converted the natural world into the cities and suburbs and agriculture that we need to support our enormous needs. And I'm not here to make a value judgment about that. I'm not here to suggest that we don't do that, because we already have done that. I am here to make a value judgment about that, though. This suburban space was developed for the aesthetic values, to meet the aesthetic values of this homeowner. It was developed for convenience, but it was not developed with the idea of sharing that space with any other living thing. Because remember, we didn't think we had to do that. But it could have been. And I'm going to argue that if this homeowner had developed his yard in order to share it with other living things, it would enrich his or her life. It would not be a penalty. So I just want to emphasize, I'm not talking about humans disappearing from the earth. I realize I'm not going to get very far with that one. I am talking about humans sharing the earth. Not because we're nice guys, but because we absolutely need to for our own well-being. It's a selfish response. All right, before we talk a little bit more about how to do that, let's look at what's happening to the plants and animals in the US. We have 200,000 species of plants and animals, and folks at the State Natural Heritage Centers all over the country are busy measuring the conservation status of each one of those species. A huge job. They don't publish on it very often. And the last time they published, they'd looked at 1/8 of the species, and out of the 1/8 of the species, they had found 4,252 to be imperiled, on the brink of extinction. They're now so few in number that they're no longer performing their roles in their ecosystem. So you can go out and you can find one here and there, but they are functionally extinct. That's out of 1/8 of the species. If that same pattern holds when all 200,000 species are assessed, it could be as many as 33,000 species of plants and animals ready to disappear. And unfortunately, that number is not getting smaller. It's getting bigger every single day. So I call that an extinction crisis. It's one that you don't hear about in the news. You don't hear about when we have major elections, as if it doesn't exist and as if it doesn't matter. We know more about birds than any other group because you've got more birders out there measuring what birds do. One of the things birders do is a breeding bird survey. They've been doing it since 1966, counting the number of birds that breed in North America. This is data from the neotropical migrant populations along the Mississippi Flyway and the Atlantic Flyway. You can see the Mississippi Flyway is doing better than the Atlantic Flyway, but neither flyway is headed in the right direction. So from this breeding bird survey, we now know that birds that used to be common, like the wood thrush, have lost almost 50% of their population since 1966. Golden wing warblers lost 66% of its population. Cerulean warbler has lost 84% of its population. I could do this all night because 127 species of neotropical migrants are in steep decline. This is just a reminder that biodiversity is an essential, non-renewable natural resource. It's essential because, believe me, we humans will not stick around long on this planet as the only species. We need lots of help. It's a non-renewable natural resource because when these species go extinct, they're not coming back. Not in any time frame that would help us. Yet that's what we're doing. We are actually forcing them to extinction, not on purpose. As a matter of fact, we put aside parks and preserves in order to help keep these species around. They're not working. So we need to understand why in order to help fix the problem. Why aren't they working? There's a couple of reasons. There's evolutionary reasons and there's ecological reasons. Let's just talk about one because that can describe the whole problem. When you take a large area and you shrink it down to a small area, you're taking large populations and shrinking them down to small or tiny populations. And that's the problem. Tiny populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why is that? Because all populations fluctuate. Good times that go up, bad times that go down. If you're a large population, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals to carry on so that you can rebound when times get better. If you're a tiny population in your down cycle, you probably hit zero. You blink out of your little habitat patch. And that's local extinction. And that's what's happening to plants and animals in our little habitat patches all over the country, all over the world. We know that because there's a number of studies that have measured this. Some of them are quite long. They're 100 years old. And they're all finding the same thing. Our natural areas are not large enough to sustain the nature we need. And that includes the largest national parks. Okay, a lot of bad news. So I'm going to have a drink. And then we're going to talk about the good news. The good news is that if we do what we talked about before and share the spaces that we've taken, we can turn a lot of this around. Let's just talk about where we live. Let's talk about that suburban-urban matrix. Our challenge is to raise the carrying capacity of those areas. We know how to do this now because carrying capacity depends on plants. If we put the plants back into our living spaces, if we put enough plants back, we can raise the carrying capacity to the point where they will become functional ecosystems once again. So, is that all we have to do? Just add plants? Well, remember why we're adding plants. We're adding plants because they are the first trophic level. They are the basis of the food web. And unfortunately, all plants are not equal in their ability to support food webs. Which means if we're going to add these plants in order to create food webs to support all the other animal life, we need to put the right plants back into our living systems. Here's an example. This is autumn olive, genus Elaeagnus on the left. People down south call it ugly Agnes, and I think that's a good name. It was brought over as an ornamental about 100 years ago, but since escaped is a major invasive species in the east. As you move further west, you've got Russian olive doing the same thing in our riparian systems. A native of China, or of Asia, where it supports a lot of biodiversity, but over here it's very poor at supporting biodiversity, and I'll tell you why in a second. The problem is that it's displacing native plants that are good at supporting biodiversity. So now, at least where I come from, their entire, acre after acre of solid ugly Agnes, keeping these other plants from doing their job. If ugly Agnes was the ecological equivalent of the native plants that it's displacing, again, we wouldn't have a problem. Our ecosystems would look different, but they still would function in the same way. It's not, though, because it's very poor at supporting food webs, because it is very poor at supporting our local insects. How do I know that? That's what my research is about. That's what we've been measuring at the University of Delaware for the past several years. And these are just a few data looking at caterpillars. The larvae of Lepidoptera, the moths and butterflies. And what you're looking at, the green bars, are the caterpillars on native plants versus the caterpillars on non-native plants. This is the total. And large common garden experiments we're still analyzing the data for this, but it's a study about 6 years old at this point, broken up into generalists and specialists, which we'll talk about in a second. So this is the abundance. We've got a lot more caterpillars on the native plants, a lot more species of caterpillars on the native plants, which means when we come in with our bulldozers and we take out the native plant communities and put in Lagerstromia, crepe myrtle, and all these plants from someplace else, we're not going to have very many caterpillars. Does that matter? Well, it matters if you eat caterpillars. It matters to this common yellowthroat who's trying to feed his young. You can say, well, if this guy's in an area where there's 5 times fewer caterpillars, we'll just ask him to forage 5 times harder. No, he's already foraging all day long. 1 trip every 5 minutes, 156 trips a day. We cannot ask him to do that 5 times harder. The end result is you will have 5 times less bird biomass in an area where you've taken away 5 times the amount of food. I mean, this is not rocket science. Even birds need to eat. Here's a data set from our ornamental plantings, from our yards. What I did was go to Michael Dorr's manual for woody landscape plants, and he recommends that we landscape with 69 genera of alien plants and 101 genera of native plants. And we went and looked up the number of caterpillar species in the mid-Atlantic states that can make a living on each one of those plant genera. And on average, these are all ornamentals now. On average, 4 species of caterpillars can make a living on the alien ornamentals, and 72 species can make a living on the native ornamentals. So when we landscape with non-natives, we lose a tremendous amount of insect diversity. Why can't our insects eat alien plants? Most people think insects can eat any plant, and if you see them eating any plant, you have to kill them right away. That's what we have been trained to do in our garden clubs, and that's what most of us do. But that's an urban legend. Insects are very fussy about what they can eat because plants have made them that way. Plants do not want to be eaten. Plants want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So in order to keep insects and other things from eating their leaves, they have put nasty-tasting chemicals into their leaves. If you don't believe me, when you walk to your car, grab a leaf of anything and eat it and see if it tastes good. It's not going to taste good. It's a very effective defense. It keeps most of the herbivores of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why I can look out there and I see it's green. It's not all eaten. Most of that foliage is inedible to most of the things that want to eat it. Yet we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do this? How do they get around these chemical defenses? Well, they do it by specializing. There are lots of types, lots of classes of chemical defenses out there, thousands of types of chemicals defending those leaves. So insects pick one class, one group of compounds, and they develop the enzymes and the behavior, the life history adaptations that allow them to eat that plant without dying. The physiological mechanisms that allow them to store and excrete it and eat the plant without dying. That's a great set of adaptations, but it takes a long evolutionary exposure to a particular plant lineage that carries this particular type of chemical defense. That's called specialization, and the monarch is an excellent example of this. Monarchs, of course, are specialists on milkweeds. That's all they eat, and what they've really specialized on are the chemicals in milkweed leaves, which are cardiac glycosides. So by the way, when you're walking to your car, don't eat a milkweed. You have milkweeds up here, don't eat that. Because those cardiac glycosides will stop your heart. It's a good defense. It doesn't stop the heart of the monarch, and they do have hearts, because they've got those physiological adaptations to deal with that defense. That's the upside of specializing. The monarch can now eat milkweed with very little competition from other insects or other anything, because very few things are able to eat that toxic plant. Upside of specializing. The downside of specializing is that now that's all the monarch can eat. So again, if we landscape in a way that takes away the milkweeds, the monarch cannot crawl off and start to eat oak trees or grass or violets or anything else. It'll simply disappear. This is the double-toothed prominent. It's a caterpillar that only eats elm. And not only is it adapted to the defensive secondary metabolic compounds in elm leaves, it's started to look like the edge of an elm leaf. Why does it want to do that? We've got all these birds out there trying to find caterpillars to eat them. And you might think birds hunt caterpillars, but they don't. They hunt caterpillar damage. It was actually research done right here in Maine that showed that birds look for holes in leaves. And when they find a hole in the leaf, then they search all around that hole and try to find the caterpillar that made it. So you see this guy's game plan here. He's sitting in the area that he's just eaten. And he says, there's no holes here. And he hopes that the bird flies on. And it works really well for the double-toothed prominent as long as there's elm around. But if the Dutch elm disease comes and takes out the elm trees, this guy disappears. That's all he can eat. It's not just caterpillars that are specialists. This is the elderberry beetle, only eats elderberry. Dogbane beetle only eats dogbane. This is a leaf-footed bug, a Korean bug, only eats ash. If the emerald ash borer comes and takes out all of our ashes, this guy is going to disappear. And that's the problem. 90% of the insect herbivores that are out there are specialists, just like the ones I've just shown you. So again, if we change the landscape, change the native plant communities to the point where the plants that support these insects are not there anymore, we're going to lose 90% of the insect herbivores that were once in our communities. So typically it's not gardeners who are upset. It's the things that eat insects that are upset. And it turns out it's an awful lot of creatures that depend on insect protein to make it through their day. For example, all spiders eat insects, or they eat other spiders that eat insects. And again, your gardeners might say, well, that's okay, I don't like spiders either. But spiders are really important components of the food web. Birds eat a lot of spiders. Other insects eat insects. Frogs eat insects. Toads eat insects. All of the amphibians eat insects. Lizards eat insects. Bats eat insects. Even our rodents eat insects. We think of rodents as seed eaters, and they do eat seeds when they can't find insects. The reason they're looking for insects is because insects are such good food. There's some studies that have shown that pound for pound, there's twice as much protein in insect meat as there is in beef. And insects have fat bodies, organs in their abdomen that are extremely high in lipids and energy, and allows these little guys to grow quickly and reproduce quickly, which they want to do because there's so many things that want to eat them. But it's the same reason that larger organisms are eating insects. The skunk is digging up your lawn to get the grubs that are in your lawn. Possums eat a lot of insects. Even things we don't think of as insectivores eat a lot of insects, like foxes, like black bears. 23% of a black bear's diet is insects. That's a sharp-shinned hawk. Does it eat insects? No. So you say, there we go. We can have sharp-shinned hawks in our suburban neighborhoods, even if we have no insects. But no, you can't, because this is a bird predator, and the birds that it's eating needed insects to become birds. So it doesn't need insects directly, but it is still dependent on the health of the insect community where it lives. And so is the garter snake. Garter snakes don't eat insects directly, but they eat the frogs and the toads that ate the insects. You cannot remove insects from our local food webs without those food webs collapsing. This is the group that needs insects as much as anything, our baby birds. This is the group that I hope is tearing at your heartstrings. Our baby birds need insects because this is a list of the bird community, the bird families in North America, the terrestrial bird families in North America that rear their young on insects. It's 96% of them. 96% of our birds depend on insects when they're making babies. We are so used to thinking of birds as seed and berry eaters that I can pick up any book about landscaping for birds and all they'll talk about is putting in plants that make seeds or berries, which is great for the seed and berry eaters at a particular time of their life. But when they're making more babies or more birds, they need insects. So we need to make insects, which means I can generalize and say that this brown thrasher is not going to be able to bring its offspring through to maturity if it's in a land without enough insects. And that is such a land. And we did a study last summer. We're making the assumption that we're actually going to change the way our suburban neighborhoods look. So around the University of Delaware, in Delaware and Southeast PA and Maryland, we picked out 22 developments built by 22 different developers. And they were built between 1992 and 2006, so I call them sprawl developments. And we looked at the way they were landscaped. We chose 3 houses from each development randomly, and the random process was we just started knocking on houses from the corner of the street, and the first person to answer the door that allowed us to run all over their property was the house that was chosen. And we measured everything we could about those properties, and this is what we found. Out of the area that was landscaped, 92% was lawn. So we're talking about barren landscapes there, 92% lawn. So very few plants in there, but the plants that were there, 74% of the species were non-native. They were from someplace else, from outside of our local food webs. 79% of the actual plants were alien, and 9% were highly invasive. Not because they had invaded these properties, but because the homeowner had planted the invasive. We also we compared the amount of tree biomass. I mean, these areas used to be forested, so how much of that forest is left in our suburban neighborhoods compared to an intact forest nearby? And what we found was that only 10% of the tree biomass exists in our suburban neighborhoods. If trees are making food that runs food webs, we have just thrown out 90% of the food, which is why when you look out your window, if you live in a typical development, you don't see anything. You don't see anything because if somebody threw away 90% of my food, I would leave. And so do the animals that depend on that food. So I'm trying to encourage people to think about their properties in a different way. We've only thought about how they look in the past, and we can still think about that. But we now occupy such a huge percentage of the U.S. that we need to think about our properties in terms of their ability to make the ecosystem services that keep us alive. If we're going to try to create clean water, which is an excellent idea, lawn is not the way to go. We do not want 92% lawn because when it rains, it gathers up all the fertilizer and herbicides that we just put on our lawn, and it runs off into our watershed, polluting the Chesapeake and everything else. So we've got to reduce the amount of lawn if we want clean water. If we want to sequester carbon dioxide, we have to do better than Bradford pears. We need a lot of long-lived, dense trees to hold that carbon, and certainly more than 10% of the tree biomass that we have here. And if you want to support biodiversity, you've got to use plants that evolved within your food web, your local food web. We can do all these things right at home. We can be much more effective than we are. This is my neighbor's house, and he's at one end of the spectrum because 100% of the plants on his 10 acres are non-native. Got Euonymus elatus, highly invasive, a whole row in there. 32, 34 Bradford pears. I'll have to count them again. And then it goes on for there. Got a lot of lawn. You can't see it from here. But I think my neighbor is typical of a lot of homeowners in that he doesn't know anything about plants. He doesn't care about plants. He didn't plant any of these plants, and he didn't choose any of these plants. He simply hired a landscaper, and this is what he got. And he's completely happy with it because he had one goal. And that goal was to fit in with the neighbors. I didn't count. Should we be upset with the landscaper that gave my poor unknowing neighbor a 100% alien landscape. Well, let's give the landscaper a break, because that is exactly what the landscaper was trained to do. The landscaper was trained, of course, by the horticulture industry. It's an industry based on beauty. Horticulturists are artists. Their job is to paint the landscape with beautiful plants. And if you use plants from all over the world, you have a much bigger palette to work with. We have forgotten all the other important things that plants do. We now see them only as decorations. We can still choose beautiful plants for our yard, but we need to think about those other ecosystem services, particularly providing the basis of those food webs when we're making selections for our local gardens. This is a picture from a horticulture magazine that tells me what my backyard should look like. And if I'm landscaping for a sense of place, the sense of place here is Beijing. Because every plant here, except for the cool season European grass, is from China. So aesthetically, it works beautifully, and that, of course, is what's being advertised here. Ecologically, it's a disaster. There's no food web here at all, because none of those plants are supporting anything. Speaking of a sense of place, my wife and I took a road trip, our first road trip of our marriage. Last summer, we drove from Oxford, Pennsylvania to Portland, Oregon. We were delivering a car for a friend. And every time I pulled off to get gas, I stopped at the nearest development and took a picture. If we were landscaping to celebrate our natural heritage or our sense of place, I would be able to recognize where I was based on the biome, the plant community in that particular location. A biome, of course, is a group of plants that's adapted to the latitude and the longitude and soil type and altitude and rainfall patterns, and they're very distinct all over the country. So, where was I? That's Portland, Oregon. That is the Douglas fir, cedar, climax forest. This is Bozeman, Montana, the High Plains Prairie. This is Oxford, Pennsylvania, eastern deciduous forest. Belvedere, Illinois, mixed deciduous forest. We obviously are not celebrating our natural heritage or a sense of place. We're celebrating the ability to fit in with the neighbors. We've got one stereotypical type of landscape with a very few number of plants, very few species that we use all over the country. There are downsides to landscaping like this. I'm not going to talk about the diseases that we have brought in with non-native alien plants. I'm not going to mention the chestnut blight that wiped out a major dominant hardwood up and down the Appalachians so that we could see what Japanese chestnut looked like in our yards. I'm not going to mention that. I am going to talk about the fact that many of these plants don't stay where we plant them. Of course, the plant does, but its propagules don't. What you're looking at is Fair Hill Preserve. This is a little park, one of those preserves I was talking about that I drive by on the way to work every day when I go to work. And there's a period in the spring of a week or a week and a half where plants from Asia leaf out before plants from North America. And it's a very convenient time to assess the alien load in a deciduous forest. So what you're looking at here in Fair Hill Preserve are all plants from China. And all of our favorites are here. We've got multiflora rose, we've got Amur honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle, Japanese knotweed, we've got Oriental bittersweet, ugly Agnes, Norway maple, Ailanthus, I mean, you name it, privet, they're all here, and they're all escapees from our garden, every last one of them. This is Cape May, New Jersey, extremely important stopover point for migrating birds. They stop at Cape May to get a good meal before they continue off across the Delaware and Chesapeake Bays. And these are sweet gum trees. They don't look like sweet gum trees because they're covered with porcelain berry, another escapee from our garden. If you pull the porcelain berry off the sweet gum trees, they're dead. They're just sticks at this point. So now the migrating birds have to get their food from porcelain berry, and I wish them luck. 85% of our invasive woody plants in this country that we are spending billions of dollars trying to control every year are escapees from our gardens. 85%. We're spending billions of dollars trying to control them on the one hand. On the other hand, we're selling them in our gardens, in our nurseries, because we are a curious species. This is a list of just some of the ornamental plants that are now serious invasives. Many of them are still for sale. And the reason I show this is to demonstrate one thing, lag time. Japanese honeysuckle was sold in the nursery trade for 80 years before it escaped. For 80 years, it behaved itself, was a nice ornamental, and the nursery trade folks would have argued there's nothing wrong with this plant because it's not invasive. Of course, that ignores the food web issues. And then they stopped selling it because everybody already owned it. It had escaped and is now, I mean, that is the major understory plant at my house. It is absolutely everywhere. The curious thing is that it didn't display those behaviors for 80 years, which is a very long time. And every one of these species behaved itself for a while before it became invasive. The problem with that is that it means if we look at the plants for sale in our nursery trade, even if they're not currently invasive, we don't know whether they will be in the future. Some will never become, but it's very difficult to predict which ones will and which ones won't. So we're taking a chance. When we're trying to restore the ecological integrity of this suburban yard here, it's not just the amount of plants that we need to think about. We certainly have to get some more plants into that system, but the type of plant becomes very important in this restoration. So you might think that the solution is simply to plant native plants, and then our food webs will be intact and everybody will be happy. But our research has shown that all native plants are not created equal in their ability to support food webs either. Some are really good and some are really bad. So if we're trying to restore biodiversity in our suburban neighborhoods as fast as possible, let's focus on the really good ones. We don't have to eliminate the bad ones, but we don't want to only use them. This is a list ranking all of the plant genera that occur in the mid-Atlantic states. Most of them occur up here as well. The little numbers after each plant genus are the number of species of caterpillars, the number of species of bird food that each one of these genera can support. We use this list to compare. We can pick any two plant genera and see which one is going to be better at making bird food. So memorize that. And then let's do that. Let's make a comparison. Let's compare tulip tree, Liriodendron tulipifera, really important forest tree where I come from. We have forests that are monocultures of tulip tree because of the way we treated these forests. So it'd be nice if they supported something. Let's compare that to one of the oaks, Quercus. We go to our list. We see Quercus is number one. 534 species of caterpillars, 534 species of bird food in the mid-Atlantic, just the mid-Atlantic states on oaks, compared to tulip trees support 21. These are both good native plants. We don't want a monoculture of oaks or a monoculture of anything, but if you had space for one plant in your yard and you were trying to promote biodiversity, would you plant an oak or would you plant a tulip tree? That's what this list is for. If you had a tulip monoculture as a woodlot, would you try to diversify it a little bit? Maybe get some oaks in there. That's how we're going to use this list. What about redbud? Native plant pushed by the native plant industry because it's beautiful. It's as pretty as anything China could throw at us. What is its wildlife value compared to black cherry or one of the native prunus that is not typically in the native plant trade? It's not in the native plant trade because at least down where I come from, landscapers don't like it. They will tell you, if you're like my neighbor who hires a landscaper, he will simply cut out the black cherries and not tell you anything. If you question him, he'll say, they're weeds. You know the definition of a weed? A weed is a plant out of place. And believe me, black cherry is not out of place. It's not out. He calls it a weed because it's messy, meaning it makes more black cherries. And it also gets tent caterpillars, meaning it supports biodiversity. So he says, get rid of them. It's number 2 on our list. Prunus, number 2. 456 species of bird food on our native prunus, compared to redbud supports 19. Now again, I am not saying get rid of our redbuds. I am saying let's not make that the only native plant that we're going to rely on. And certainly don't let your landscaper throw away your native prunus. It's an extremely valuable plant genus. If you keep some prunus in your yard, you're going to have insects that look like this. That's a cecropia moth. I realize a lot of people don't like insects, but nobody's going to tell me that's not a beautiful creature. Or its larvae that are equally beautiful. You're going to have the tiger swallowtail. Its favorite host plant is black cherry. Now, a lot of us are running around making butterfly gardens. And what do? We put in nectar plants and hope that we attract butterflies from someplace else. But more and more of those someplace else's are parking lots or malls or new roads. Why not make a complete butterfly garden that includes the larval hosts of the butterflies we're trying to attract? Butterflies do not materialize from thin air. They come from larval hosts. And the favorite larval host of tiger swallowtail is black cherry. If you have black cherry, you could have the Io moth and its beautiful larvae. You could have the coral hair streak. You could have the paddle caterpillar. Have you played with the paddle caterpillar yet this year? You could have the red spotted purple. It's a specialist on black cherry. And its larva that looks like bird down. You could have the Promethean moth, and in its larvae, you could have the purple-crested slug, the Crocus geometer. You could have the spotted apatales, the saddleback caterpillar, the white furcula. You could have the spiny rose caterpillar. You could have the lunate zale. Who would not want the lunate zale? The yellow-haired dagger moth, the nascent slug, and 450 other types of bird food if you keep some native prunus in your yard. This is a native prunus. This is American plum. Beautiful bloom in the spring. It is in the ornamental or the native plant trade. And it actually stoloniferous, makes these little what do you call it? Clones, groupings that help reduce the size of your lawn. A very effective plant. And it's also a magnet for native bees. Almost 5,000 species of native bees in this country, and they all need pollen. They love our native prunus. What about an oak? If we put an oak in our yard, we could have the puss caterpillar. We could have the polyphemus moth, the buck moth, the white-marked tussock moth, the saddle prominent, double-line prominent, white-dotted prominent. We could have the laugher. We could have the lace-cap caterpillar, the banded tussock moth, the smaller parasa, the unicorn caterpillar. We could have the bride. These are real common names. This is an underwing, and all the underwings have to be named after women. So this is the bride. We could have the crown slug. We could have the hag moth that thinks it's a tarantula. We could have the streaked dagger moth, the red-humped oak worm, the confused wood grain, or the spun glass slug, which I think is the coolest caterpillar in North America. You know where I took every one of these pictures? In my front yard. There is no rule that says your front yard cannot be a productive place. And that is what my front yard looked like when we built the house. This area was mowed for hay. There was absolutely nothing there. That's what it looked like this spring from the same perspective. See, I got a little lawn there. I'm traditional. If you're an entomologist, which I am, and you're trying to restore something, this is the pinnacle of restoration. This is the hickory horned devil, the largest caterpillar in North America, about 7 inches long. It's already extinct from New England. I'm sorry, folks. Maybe you can bring it back if you put in its favorite host plants. I got it right next to my hose faucet last year. I turned around, and there it was. I never thought I would see the thing, but the restoration is working. You know, our migrating birds know where the food is. This is a study that one of my grad students has just finished up. Here's the Fagaceae, the oaks and the beeches, and this is the amount of bird foraging on that particular plant family compared to all the others. They go to where the food is. So birds are smart. All right, what does a biodiversity-friendly suburb look like? This is the most important thing we can do. We need to create biological corridors that connect those isolated habitat fragments. Because if we connect them, they're no longer isolated. And if they're no longer isolated, the populations within them are no longer tiny, and when they fluctuate, they would no longer blink out in that particular fragment. We need to build those biological corridors out of the plants that are going to support the food webs we're trying to restore, and I suggest we put them in area that is now in lawn, because lawn is the second least productive thing that we can do with the landscape. The first least productive is paving it over. So let's flip-flop the landscaping paradigm we have followed for the last century. What we've done is build our house, then we carve out our little areas for our flower beds, plant a tree here, there, and there. And when we get tired of landscaping, everything by default becomes lawn. Let's turn that on its head. Let's build the house and then carve out the area where we want lawn. Where do we want lawn? Lawn is the perfect place to walk. So we want it where we're going to walk, and preferably flat areas. We don't want it on a slopey area. That's too hard to mow. So if you want to throw the Frisbee in the backyard, you need some lawn there. If you want to have your wedding in the front yard, some lawn there. You want to move to the backyard, you need a nice grass path. Wherever you want lawn, great. Design it, and then everything by default becomes heavily planted. What are you going to plant it in? It depends on where you are. How are we going to get so many plants into our landscape without them looking wild and messy? We can do it. We have a landscape architect right over here who's going to tell us how to do it. It's the design challenge of our times because we're not used to looking at plants like this. But believe me, we can do it. And you guys have so many wonderful examples of densely planted areas that it shouldn't be a big challenge for you at all. If we do this in half of the area that we now have in lawn, let's simplify it. Say we've got 40 million acres in lawn, and we build biological corridors in 20 million of those acres. We can create a new national park. We can call it Homegrown National Park. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, the Badlands, plus Olympic National Park, plus Sequoia National Park, Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. If you add up all of those national parks, it's still less than 20 million acres. So our Homegrown National Park is going to be the biggest national park by far. Let's turn areas that look like this into areas that look like that, this into that, this into that, into that, into that. We call this the Butterfly Trail at the University of Delaware. Notice, no, the Lepidoptera Trail. It's not the butterfly garden because it's attracting all of the Lepidoptera and all the other insects that nobody cares about and all the things that eat those insects. We have little grass paths that wander throughout there, and the public comes and looks at this. I show you this picture for two reasons. It's about the size of a regular backyard, and a year before I took this picture, it was all lawn. So it doesn't take half a lifetime to build these spaces. Or you could build a woodland path right in your backyard. That could be the edge of your property. And you wouldn't know because it curves around, disappears, looks like you own the rest of the world, looks like you're Ted Turner. And now it's got appropriate woodland plantings instead of lawn. You don't have to mow your backyard anymore, and your neighbor won't care because your neighbor can't see you anymore. But if you convince your neighbor to do the same thing, then you've got that connectivity I'm talking about that will connect with the woodlot at this end, the woodlot at this end of your street, and the life can flow back and forth instead of running into all these dead zones. We'll still have lawn. We'll still get to cut it. Just won't be as much. You know, this was in North Carolina. I was flying and looked down. Here's a brand new development carved out of the forest. If this were appropriately landscaped instead of completely barren, the animals that lived over here could connect with the animals that lived over here. That's just what I'm talking about. Okay, now here, there are two things we need to think about when we're building our biological corridors. This is the first. Here's a homeowner that puts his or her house into a forest, and this, by the way, is a tulip tree monoculture, 100% tulips. But he did it without cutting down the trees, so that's great. But then it did what we do all over the world. Under every tree we have out there, we mow. We mow because we love short grass. Why do we love short grass? It's really a curious behavior. Evolutionary psychologists have been thinking about why we love short grass for a long time, and they've got a couple of hypotheses. The one they like the most is that we spent a lot of time in Africa, and every time we went into tall grass or bushy scrub, we didn't come out. So only people that like short grass were the ones that left Africa. You know, it makes a lot of sense. We like short grass so we can see our enemies before they see us. And after we left Africa, we didn't have to worry about the lion anymore, but we still had to worry about our neighbors. We want to see if our neighbors are coming. So that's a challenge, but, you know, not in our biological corridors. We need the canopy, the subcanopy, the understory, shrub layer, and healthy forest floor because important components of our biodiversity live in each one of those strata. We can have the tallest trees in the middle, heavily underplanted by understory trees, heavily underplanted by shrubs. If we create biological corridors that are nothing but mulch beds, we don't have enough plants. We don't want to see mulch. We don't want to see the ground. We can be creative with our perennial and annual plants in the sun on the edge of our corridors. We can pick particular plants that are really productive at bringing the type of nature into your life that you're looking for. And this is just an example that I discovered at our house. This is alternate leaf dogwood, Cornus alternifolia. Beautiful bloom in the spring. That turns into a beautiful berry set. In the spring, it makes lots of nice insects for our birds when they're reproducing, but then after the little ones are running around, they can come and eat these berries. This particular plant I put next to my bathroom window. It has grown up past the bathroom window. So now when I look out, that's what I see. And I also see all the birds coming in to eat the insects on this, and the berries on this particular tree. So many different birds have come in that I've started a photographic record of all the different species. I have missed some, including just 2 days ago. I've been chasing a yellow-breasted chat around my yard for weeks trying to get a good picture. I was shaving to get on the plane to come here, and I looked in the mirror, and he's sitting right there laughing at me. So I missed him, but I've got the Baltimore oriole female, the orchard oriole female, cedar waxwing, catbird, bluebird mommy, bluebird baby, brown thrasher. There's a mockingbird that came in to get the berries, but he has a insect instead. Always take the insect over berries. Warbling vireo, not a good picture, but he was back again this year. I got to get him. Peewee, red-eyed vireo, robin, kingbird, hungry kingbird, and a ruby-crowned kinglet that's not there to eat the berries, it's just there to eat the insects. Now, my wife and I do a study abroad trip. Every January, we take students down and go all over Costa Rica, and we run into birding groups all the time who paid big bucks to go down to Costa Rica to see birds. All I have to do is go to the bathroom, and I can see birds. If I don't want to do my birding from the bathroom, I can look at the bedroom window at my elderberry, and I get the same cast of characters doing exactly the same thing. Now, these plants in our biological corridors, at least in the eastern deciduous forests, are going to make leaves. You folks up here with your conifers don't have to worry about this, but as you move further south, people don't like leaves. We all freak out. We get out our leaf blowers and our rakes, and we rake them all up and put them in garbage bags as if they were trash, put them out for the curb. Then we run to Home Depot, and we buy mulch, we buy fertilizer, we buy hoses. We try to buy all the ecosystem services that we just threw out. What we can't buy are the arthropods that live in that leaf litter. Why do we do this? Well, two reasons. If you leave the leaves there, they might hurt your lawn. And what if one of them blew onto your neighbor's yard? That would be bad news. But look, you can anchor them with a nice fern garden. Fern gardens down where we come from are not nearly as common as they are up here because we don't have the proper substrate. I know this guy. All he did was not rake his oak leaves, and he created that substrate, and all these ferns came in on their own. He didn't plant a single one. This creates a perfect sponge when you get those summer thunderstorms. Instead of all the water running off your sun-baked lawn, it soaks in, and we replenish our water table. And it has created the perfect foraging place for our beleaguered thrushes. Wood thrushes are disappearing because we are throwing away the food they eat. They eat arthropods in leaf litter, and we're throwing it away. Ovenbirds, they're called ovenbirds because they make their nests out of leaves on the ground, look like little ovens. Kentucky warblers, hooded warblers forage on the ground. A lot of birds forage for food on the ground, and we're throwing away what they eat. This is something that all birds do, though. They make eggs, and those eggs are made of calcium. Where do the birds get their calcium? I didn't know. Everybody, you think I'm going to say insects, but no. Evidence is they get it from the shells of land snails. And the land snails are on the leaf litter that we just threw away. So even birds that spend all their time in the canopy will come to the forest floor, eat these land snails when they're building up calcium to make eggs. We cannot afford to throw it away. People are saying, what happened to all the fireflies? Where are the fireflies going? Well, that's what an adult firefly, a Lampyrid, it's actually a beetle, looks like. That's what the larva looks like. Where does it live? It lives in leaf litter, and we just threw it away. That's where your fireflies are. They're in the garbage. They're certainly not on your lawn that has ChemLawn on it. So nature these days is what we make of it. We can make a lot of it by landscaping appropriately with the plants that support nature, or we can make a little of it. It's our choice. There are more and more people that are landscaping with a greater percentage of native plants, with more plants in general. And this has allowed us to actually do some research to demonstrate whether anything I just told you is correct or not. This is a landscape done by Larry Weiner. He's a local landscaper who's been landscaping with natives for 20 years. And when I met him about 5 years ago, I asked him to give me the names and addresses of some of the landscapes he's done near the University of Delaware so that we could compare the biodiversity in these suburban plots with a standard plot nearby. When I say we, I mean Karen Berghart was the student who did this work. She had a good time doing it, and she did an excellent job. This is a traditional landscape, by the way, in case you've forgotten. Karen controlled for everything, the property size, the house footprint, and the amount of plant biomass on each property. She was not comparing bare lawn with a forest. So all the properties, both the native and the traditional landscapes, had the same amount of plants. The only thing that differed was the percentage of native plants. And she measured caterpillars and breeding birds. She found significantly more caterpillars on the native properties, more species of caterpillars, more birds, more species of birds. But look, there were some birds on the traditional properties, and she looked at what they were. They were house sparrows, house finches, starlings, pigeons, all alien invasive species. When she took those out of the data set, and only looked at the birds of conservation concern where she did her particular study, she got the biggest difference of all, which means the birds that needed the help the most responded the most to these native type landscapings right in suburbia. That's really encouraging to me. And another thing that's encouraging to me is that the speed at which this happened. The native landscapes that Karen looked at, and they weren't entirely native by any stretch, were very young. They had only been landscaped within the last 3 years when she did this study, which meant all of the life that she recorded on those properties had come very quickly. And that's important because we're a society of instant gratification. If it took 50 years for things to change in your landscape, nobody would bother doing this. But it doesn't. It happens very quickly. I've been fooling around with this idea. You'll have to tell me later on if you think it's crazy or not, but you've heard of carbon credits. Why don't we have native credits? I know almost everybody here has their favorite non-native plant, and they've got to have it in their yard. Okay, we'll compromise, but if you put your crepe myrtle in your yard, you owe me 2 oak trees to balance out. What do you think? You think about that. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about very quickly is what people tend to worry about the most. If you invite all these insect herbivores to your native plants, they're going to eat those plants, and then you'll have holy leaves or they'll be defoliated, and that's not why we garden. That would be worse than having the leaf blow onto your neighbor's yard. You'd have holes in your leaves. So what are we going to do about that? Well, that's not going to happen because what we're really doing is building a balanced ecological community, rebuilding it in your yard. Here's an example. This is a tomato plant in our garden. It was being eaten. I went out to see what was going on. I wanted to blame it on the deer, but it actually was a tobacco hornworm. I took a picture of it and saw all these white cocoons on its back. Those are the cocoons of a little wasp, a parasitic wasp, the family Braconidae. That braconid wasp has tunneled out the insides of this caterpillar. So he's alive, but he's really dead. He's not going to eat any more tomatoes, not going to reproduce, not going to make babies. So these parasitic wasps have controlled that particular garden pest. This is a little wasp that's laying eggs in the braconic cocoons. So this pteromalid wasp is making sure that we don't have too many braconids at our house, and the braconids are making sure we don't have too many tobacco hornworms, and the tobacco hornworm is making sure we don't have too many tomatoes. So here we have a little balance in our tomato garden. Why do we have these natural enemies when maybe you or other folks don't have them? It's a good question. And one possible answer is that we've got so many tobacco hornworms, they're all season long, that there's always something for these natural enemies to eat. If there's nothing for your natural enemies to eat, they will leave. And then the bad guys come before they can come back and get them. So I thought about that. Is that the case in my yard? No. In the 10 years we've been there, that's the only one we've seen, and he's dead. So who's maintaining these natural enemies? Well, this is a sphinx moth. It's a type of sphinx moth. These guys attack sphinx moths, and it turns out we've got 13 species of sphinx moths at my house. Only one of them eats one of our garden plants. The others are eating just regular native plants, like the Pandora sphinx. We have Pandora sphinx because we have Virginia creeper. We have Virginia creeper on my back porch because I planted it there. And I planted it there so that the Pandora sphinx would come in and lay its egg on there so I could take a picture of its beautiful larva. This is manipulating nature for my own strange impulse. It works, and it comes in that color, it comes in yellow, it comes in green, and it comes covered with braconic cocoons. This is a pretty big caterpillar, and people said, aren't you afraid it's going to defoliate your Virginia creeper? No, Virginia creeper grows really fast, and in the 10 years we've been there, these are the only 3 we have seen. Why is everything so rare at my house? Look at all the things that are killing them. It is very difficult to reach maturity at my house. And we have all these other types of predators. This is a cogwheel bug eating a fall webworm. We had bad couple years of fall webworms. These guys are doing their best to control them. And we've got all those breeding birds eating caterpillars every day. A pair of bluebirds will bring back up to 300 caterpillars a day when they're feeding their young. I go out looking for caterpillars. I cannot find them because these guys have eaten them. And bluebirds are not special. All of the birds are doing the same thing. By the way, we've got a yellow-billed cuckoo this year that has eliminated my fall webworm and my poplar tent makers. I mean, those guys love fuzzy caterpillars and tents and excellent control, all from one bird. We went back to the native and traditional landscapes to measure the damage caused by insects. because people only believe numbers. We looked at the damage by sucking insects and by chewing insects. This is the percentage of leaves that were damaged. 2-year study. Look, a very low percentage of the leaves had any damage at all, but the green bars are the native properties, and they had significantly less damage than the traditional properties. Why? Because they had all those natural enemies there. They had a thriving community of natural enemies eating these guys before they got big enough to cause a lot of damage. This is the 10% damage level. It's called the aesthetic injury level. It's shown by other studies that homeowners don't even notice insect damage till about 10% of the leaves are damaged. So these homeowners would have argued they have no insects at all because these damage levels are below the 10% level, when in fact, what they really have are a lot of birds and other things eating those insects. And that's why I can look across to my other neighbor's yard, which is a woodlot, and look, it's not defoliated. It's in balance. It's got native plants, insects eating those native plants, and all the natural enemies keeping them in check. So this is a grassroots approach to conservation that I'm excited about for exactly that reason. It's something we all can do on our own with very little investment. We don't have to get the government involved, which is good these days because they're really busy. We don't have to send our money to Brazil anymore to save the rainforests. I mean, you could do that and they will take it, but we've been doing that for 30 years and they're still cutting down the rainforests. So that's not working. Let's do some conservation right in the good old temperate zone. And we get to see the results. You put these plants in your yard, you can see the life come to them. That's positive reinforcement. There's so few environmental issues where a single person can do something and see the results that's what's so positive about this. If we're interested in putting nature back into the lives of our kids, there's no better way to do it than to put it right where they live. Field trips are great for 1 hour, but it doesn't allow the child to interact with nature on their own time at their own pace. This little girl is 4 years old, and the reason she can play in this meadow is because it's 15 feet from her back porch. The reason she wants to play in this meadow is because it's interesting. If that were mowed turf with a PlayStation on it, she'd be inside learning how to plug something in her ears. So somebody once said that gardening is a way of showing that you believe in tomorrow, and I think that's never been more true than right now. Because the way we landscape today, the way we garden today is going to determine what life looks like tomorrow. Thanks very much.